Hey, deserving listeners. Today I'm going to read your mental health hot takes and talk about them. I recently sent out a survey to y'all asking for your mental health hot takes because I was doing a set of collab episodes with Isaiah from the YouTube channel called Therapy Today. It was his idea to collab, and it was his idea to poll each of our audiences for mental health hot takes. I asked y'all for your mental health hot takes, and I got hundreds of responses, but in the episode that I did with Isaiah from Therapy Today YouTube channel, we only got to like 4 or 5. So I thought, well, I should just make some episodes on my own and kind of do a lightning round of your mental health hot takes. So this is me without prepping, about how to react to each of these. We're going to just read them. By the way, I have a cold. I don't have COVID or the flu, apparently, because I took a test that tests for various flu and COVID. I don't have that. So it's just some sort of other coronavirus, is my understanding. And I'm kind of stuffed up, and I'm a little janky in the brain, insane in the membrane. But I feel if I was to record this episode this morning, I don't think my brain would have been operational. But I feel good. I feel like I'm at least quick behind a wall of snot that's in my nose, if you can hear it. All right. So and I also don't know if you can hear the rain outside. It has been raining a lot. I know people like Seattle rain, that's a big surprise, but it actually is kind of weird to have this much rain and this a volume of water. It's always kind of half drizzling in Seattle. So to get just 24/7 heavy rain is not usual. But you can sort of hear it outside, and it's warm is the thing. So that's why I have the AC on and I have the windows open, kind of not open. I don't know if you know this, but I have to keep the windows open in my office because I did such a good job of making it soundproof that it's airtight. And so I have this air meter that tells me how much carbon dioxide is building up in the room, and if I don't open the windows slightly, then while I'm recording, then I will start to suffocate in my own carbon dioxide. And that's a little counterproductive because when I open the windows, then things from outside the sound will come through, obviously. But usually in my quiet suburban Seattle neighborhood, there's not a lot of outside noises aside from the occasional airplane that flies overhead, unless it's raining. Or the neighbor's dogs decide to go on a 45-minute screaming match. Anyway, so this first hot take is deserving listener Nika. She says, the majority of people in Eastern European post-communist countries are fearful avoidance due to complex PTSD caused by the communist regime. All right, so that's Nika's hot take. The majority of people in Eastern European post-communist countries, so like Poland or something, are fearful avoidance due to complex PTSD caused by the communist regime. I don't know the exact research on this. I have seen research on this, and whenever you have a generation of people that are harmed and the various different atrocities, war atrocities, or just witnessing war, having to be a part of war, will cause, what we call intergenerational trauma or transgenerational legacies, or whatever you want to call it. And you will see effects downstream, not only of that generation, of course, but of their kids and that sort of thing. And it's my anecdotal experience working with the occasional client in Seattle that's from those areas, and also working with families, So I'll work with a 30-year-old and her parents. So I'll learn about these. And I have colleagues that are from that region therapists who emigrated in their 20s or something to come to Seattle, and they became a therapist, and I've talked with them at length about this phenomenon. And yeah, there's a whole generation of people. And we can look to various wars around the world today. There are, a dozen plus wars that are currently occurring in the world today, some of which are talked in the news, many of which are completely ignored in the news. And those individuals, the people that are there, or even people that are just, the town over from some of these atrocities, are going to have some effects on their personality. Now, it's not necessarily all negative, right? There can be positive things like prioritizing what's good in life, or coming together with meaning and purpose and generativity. But obviously there can be a lot of negative things. Anyway, if this is going to be lightning round, I've got to move forward. Alina, she says, patriarchy, this is not my brother's kid, Alina, who works for Psychology in Seattle. By the way, Alina told me, who is now soon to be an intern therapist, which I'm so proud of. They told me that whenever Alina is mentioned on the podcast, usually in praise, like, I just want to give a shout out to Alina for doing such a great job. Because someone emailed in and said, I just want to thank Alina for doing the timestamps because it's so helpful. And that's just one of the various things that Alina does for the podcast. And Alina told me at our Halloween party that they cry whenever that happens. Whenever Alina is mentioned in a positive way on the podcast, that Alina tears up, which honestly, I did not know that Alina cared. I knew Alina cared, but I didn't know Alina cared that much. So I don't know if Alina's crying right now, but yeah, thank you, Alina. And I apologize, because whenever I do these kinds of episodes where there are several questions, then Alina has to timestamp every single one. In an email episode or something, there'll be like 5 timestamps. But with an episode like this, there could literally be 75 timestamps because Alina takes the task very seriously. But anyway, so right now, Alina will have to timestamp themselves of like, talk about Alina crying. Anyway, a different Alina, she says, patriarchy is the reason we say people have big egos instead of calling it what it is, which is high levels of insecurity or low self-esteem, because that sounds weak. Okay, so patriarchy is the reason we say people have big egos instead of calling it what it really is, which is high levels of insecurity and low self-esteem. Yeah, I would agree with that. There's various different vectors and causes that we could strongly hypothesize that contribute to the notion that there are people with low security, low self-esteem, with high insecurity, and therefore are overcompensating with grandiose narcissism or bullying others. You can think of famous people that do that, politicians. And the patriarchy and other kinds of things, capitalism, or just the general culture of praising people who have quote-unquote strength and anger rather than sadness or humility or vulnerability. And because of that, you have a misunderstanding of people and a privileging of people. Yeah, it always is upsetting to me that if someone were to, like, I remember when Geraldine Ferraro was running for vice president in 1984. And as a 13-year-old, when this was happening, I remember being very excited about Walter Mondale and Ferraro, the first woman running for vice president on the Democratic ticket. And the discourse around with Americans, even Democrats, was that, well, if Mondale and Ferraro win and Mondale is incapacitated and Ferraro becomes the president, well, what about PMS? And what if we go to, because this is at the height of the tensions of nuclear annihilation with the Soviet Union, and people were saying, well, what if her hand's on the button and she starts to cry? And I mean, I didn't know it at the time because I'm only 13, but looking back, I'm like, well, I hope she would cry because that's normal. That's human. That's understandable. Now, she doesn't have to cry for Hands on the Button, but what's wrong with fucking crying? Yeah. And we still live in that world, by the way. And if you watched or are watching my reaction videos to Love is Blind Season 9, there's a whole thing about this. There's a cast member, a black guy, who cries and laughs and jumps for joy and expresses vulnerability. And there's just a lot of really regressive state. The dominant narrative around him is that all of his emotions indicate he's either developmentally disabled, autistic, neurodiverse, or he is manipulative. Or it's just like, dude, the guy's just crying. Can you just take it easy? And it's like, what year is it? 2025? Anyway, Marisol, she says the following. Someone should write Transference in Therapy for Dummies and have it be a part of first-time therapy clients. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah. I think that there should be a number of... Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Have I ever thought about, has anyone ever said this before? We have our disclosures that we're ethically and legally responsible for when it comes to informed consent with clients. But yeah, why doesn't this, I'm sure this does exist. I'm sure there's a book out there that is easy to understand and quick to read with 20 different chapters on things you should know before you enter therapy. In fact, maybe I should just Google that. Yeah, there's a bunch of books. This book I just found by Faith Freed called Starting Therapy, and it goes into deciding whether or not therapy is good for you, finding a good therapist with the right fit for you, being prepared for the first session, get the most value. Yeah, so, and I'm sure there's at least one of the books out there that goes into transference for sure. Yeah. But I don't know. On one hand, yes. On the other hand, how many people would read a book like that and not really take heed because they don't think it's going to happen to them? And it's going to be a journey regardless, even if you did know. There are plenty of clients that have had significant transference before and are entering therapy again and know that they might experience transference again, and it doesn't necessarily make it any easier. Maybe it takes the bite a little bit out of it, but because with my clients that have significant transference, usually at some point I will be confident enough in my conceptualization of them that they are experiencing transference, which of course can be manifested in a variety of ways, whether it's falling in love with your therapist or hating your therapist or whatever. Any sort of distortion that is displaced onto the therapist from their childhood is transference technically. So once I determine that that's the case, or I'm pretty confident in that conceptualization, often I will enter into a more pointed assessment, and then if I'm pretty confident, then I will explain to the client what's happening, because that's just the kind of style of therapy that I do. And even and then that can take a while, right? Because for many clients, they're like, "No, you're minimizing my feelings," or "Of course, I'm falling in love with you because I've never met anyone like you before. I just know that we're meant for each other," that kind of thing. And it might take years, literally, for them to have insight into transference, at least for portions of the day that they can look at their transference and identify it as such. It doesn't take away the intensity of it, by the way, but once they get to that point, is it any easier? Yeah, slightly, but it doesn't take it away. So, yeah, that's what I'll say. All right, Anonymous, she says, more than one thing can be true at once. Yes, agreed, Anonymous. Hard to say what you're referring to, but yeah. Martin, he says, catatonia is much more common than people realize, even trained people. Yeah, on the surface, I would agree with that because it's not talked about very often, even among clinicians. But I wonder what Martin is actually getting at here. Is there a broader definition of catatonia that he's using? Like, but yeah, it's a thing, and there's, it's a spectrum as well. Maybe Martin has experienced it himself or someone that is in his life, and it took a long time for that to be identified. I could see that happening. All right, let's take a break. All right, back from the break. Patron Jessie, she says, anxiously attached folks on the internet have weaponized attachment theory. And this is coming from an anxiously attached person. End of hot take. Anxiously attached folks, so preoccupied folks on the internet, have weaponized attachment theory. So, and Patron Jesse's like, and I'm an anxiously attached person who is observing other anxiously attached people doing this. Yeah, I wonder what specific slice of this weaponization that Patron Jesse is referring to, or maybe all of them. I've certainly seen that. I'm trying to think of an example. Like, sometimes there are people within various groups, but let's include preoccupied, attached people, or people who self-identify that way. And honestly, I would imagine most people who self-identify as preoccupied, anxious attachment probably are. But anyway, so these people on the internet might weaponize it in an echo chamber and say that their intuition or their empathy or the fact that everyone is always screwing them over is not actually because they are pushing people away or distorting, but because they have a better ability to detect bad actions by other people, which is actually kind of true. But obviously, if you overconvince yourself of that, that's weaponization, especially if you attack others with it. Anyway, there are various other versions of that. I don't see that very often. I certainly see a lot of people misunderstanding attachment theory, but not nearly as much as I see people misunderstanding other things. But anyway, Patron Mark, he says, group mob think, so group think or mob think, makes even the most reasonable and healthy people horribly dysfunctional. Yes. It's interesting to think about that people's definition of hot take, right? Maybe it's just like, this makes me hot under the collar, and it has to do with mental health. Or if it's, because sometimes hot takes are defined as like, no one else agrees with me on this, and I can't say this with, the public, but I can say it on the survey. Anyway, but yeah, that's where we have those terms from, is from the research and the observation that mob dynamics, group, in-group, out-group stuff can, people are generally reasonable, but when you see large groups of people believing in QAnon or, caravans coming across the border or whatever, people, quote unquote immigrants eating quote unquote pets. I guess I don't know why I'm putting it in quotes, but anyway, these are reasonable people spreading ridiculous, horribly dysfunctional things, and you have a group of people that believe it. Anyway, long-time lower tier patron Janine from Sydney, Australia. Janine, I like that word. I grew up with the Janine, and you don't see that name very often, but maybe it should make a comeback. Long-time patron Janine from Sydney, she says, psychologists are the police of capitalism. Wow, psychologists are the police of capitalism. Well, I don't know what Janine is getting at specifically, but if I were to take a guess that, can the field of psychology or mental health in general participate in the pros and cons of capitalism? And use their authority to keep people in line or to promote ideas of capitalism and promoting notions of meritocracy and survival of the fittest and trying to shape people to be better workers for the exploiters of labor. Yeah. The whole field of psychology, or a lot of it, the professionalization of it actually emerged at a time not only to support capitalism, unbeknownst to psychology wouldn't say, or some would actually, but it also emerged out of war, out of the effort to keep soldiers soldiering, Anyway, Jess, she says, spirituality has value for mental health. It isn't bypassing to refocus on a higher power for guidance, purpose, or direction. Having connection to your intuition, body, awareness, and aligning to a higher power can provide guideposts and boundaries during uncertain seasons. End of hot take. Yeah, Jess, I agree completely. And it is often downplayed. You'll hear me talk about that sometimes. It's been a pet peeve of mine for a long time. Not because I'm particularly spiritual, but I just don't like it when any group is unfairly treated. And within the realm of mental health, at least my observation, anecdotally in my circles anyway, if you were Christian, increasingly so over the years, you were seen as automatically a bigot or stupid or something, or superstitious or something. And are there bigoted Christians? Yes. Are there superstitions within Christianity, depending on the sort of sect that you're a part of? Yeah. But it plays a huge role. So there's two ways. There's one. So let me talk about this just for a second. When I hear people, including myself, honestly, that will say, hey, we need to recognize spirituality as a part of clients' lives, and we need to value that. Well, often the discourse that I hear among therapists and other such folks is that it's like, hey, we all know that religion is dumb, but we have to recognize that people adhere to this dumb thing. So we have to acknowledge it, go along with it, or ask people about it. It's sort of like, look, I know that my dad is stupid for watching Fox News, but if I'm going to have a relationship with him, I'm going to have to tolerate that. Or maybe a better example would be, I don't give a crap about golfing, but my mom is really into golfing, so I'm going to have to ask her about it, and I'm going to have to tolerate her telling me about her stupid golfing because that's what it's like. So I'll hear that sort of thing, or I'll hear people saying, like, it's important to recognize other people's cultures, and that's as far, which is not a malevolent or problematic take, but that's as far as they take it. But what Jess is saying, which is what I believe, which is that one could argue that the very foundation of psychology, of life, of meaning, of purpose, of the reason why we are here, religion gets at that for a lot of people. And the very foundation for humanity or purpose or life or relationships, or why people come into therapy to begin with, whether clients know it or not, has to do with the things that religion or spirituality get at. And the only way to get at those things is through spirituality, depending on what we mean by that. And with particular clients, it is not just respecting their culture, but it's required of therapists to fully grasp, or at least attempt to understand what that's like, not only with a particular client, but in humanity, in for themselves. We all have some sort of system of meaning and purpose and seeing the universe, whether we can put it into words or not. We all have a philosophy or a set of givens, or some reason why we are here, why I am here, what is good, what is bad. And sometimes that's codified into, God and the devil or whatever. But sometimes it's more amorphous than that, even for religious people. And these things are really important. All right, lightning round. I hope that my stuffy face is not annoying to people. I'm worried that it is. If it is, feel free to just pass by this episode, because there's nothing worse than having to endure a sound that's getting on your nerves. But anyway, Anna G., she says, emergency mental health services like a psychiatric hold are more damaging to the mental health of the patients than helpful and often contribute to more trauma. End of hot take. Emergency mental health services. So I'm guessing that's, they're saying like a psychiatric hold. I'm trying to figure out what else would be included in that. But yeah, if we go with psychiatric holds, involuntary, in my jurisdiction, it's for a maximum of 72 hours. It's more damaging to mental health of patients. I would say case by case, maybe, but generally speaking, no. Now, is there a better alternative that we might consider? Maybe. But when you have someone that's in a full manic episode and they aren't sleeping and they're confused and they're delusional and they're violent or at the very least committing a number of crimes, harming their own life, and they're an adult and they have money and they have a car and they have the internet, and you're a family member, a spouse, or you're a parent of someone like that, and you are attempting to corral them and they're continuing to harm themselves and others, maybe even risk killing people, killing themselves, and you don't have any other recourse and you seek this, which is hard to acquire, honestly, and someone is involuntarily hospitalized, I would say, from my experience, that those involuntary holds are by far more benefit than harm. Can they be traumatic? Yeah. I mean, I had a client who, in the midst of a manic episode, was delusional and hallucinating and had been involuntarily hospitalized. And while he was in the hospital, I can't remember the exact sequence, but I think he was violent and non-compliant, and so they had to strap him down to the bed, unfortunately. And he was, beside it. That would be hard for anyone, even if you were not going through a manic episode. But in his mania, he thought that aliens were after him, and he literally believed that as he was strapped down to the bed, that his spine was being ripped out, that aliens or nefarious people were ripping his spine out of his back. And he fully, after recovery and medication, he was telling me his memory. And this is a memory that he had. When you're hallucinating, it's not a different person. You went through those things, and that's traumatic. Now, is that the fault of the hospital? No, it's a byproduct of the break from reality that this person had. What else are we supposed to do? I suppose you could argue a more humane thing would be to knock him out, right? To heavily sedate him so he can't even think straight, right? It's hard to know when to do that. And of course there are risks from that, and that could be traumatic. Anyway, now, can psychiatric holds harm people? Yeah. And I see a lot of people online talking about this sort of thing. I feel like maybe it happens more often than I have seen in my life, not only of psychiatric holds harming people, but of therapists, mental health people jumping to calling the authorities way faster than they should. For me and for my supervisees, I have a whole system of how to assess the risk of either, usually what we're worried about is suicide or homicide. And there's a way of system, and I have my way. There's other systems as well in terms of determining the imminent nature of danger, right? If someone thinks about suicide, but they don't have a plan, then it's unlikely that it's imminent, right? If someone has a plan, but they're still talking with you and they have a family member that's with them all the time, and the client is saying, even though I really want to kill myself, I do have a plan, I'm not going to do it in the next couple days, then, depending on what that looks like, if there aren't other risk factors like alcohol or firearms or something, then it's not imminent. Whereas there are, I could give you examples of imminence, and the same applies to homicidal thoughts. And so I hear stories online of people claiming that they were hospitalized involuntarily for telling their therapist that they had once thought about suicide, even though currently they don't really want to and they don't have a plan, this sort of thing. And so on one hand, I'm thinking, my God, that therapist is a fucking idiot. And the other thing is like, even if as a therapist you do call the authorities, us therapists, we don't have the authority to hospitalize people. We only can call the professionals that do these assessments, and these people know what they're doing. Now, can you have some of those people that are doing the assessments not know what they're doing? Yeah, but that's pretty rare. But then there's a third step of those, what we call them as county designated mental health professionals who are doing the assessments. Well, the hospital can do their own assessment as well and say, this person doesn't need to be there. So, I mean, once the mental health professionals have said yes, the hospital isn't likely to push back on that. But anyway, so on one hand, yeah, are there some therapists that have an itchy trigger finger on this because they don't know what the fuck they're doing? Yeah, I'm sure that happens. But to have the whole system break down, I'm sure that happens too, but rarer. But I also think there's a chance that some of these people online are not telling the full story. And they did not like being involuntarily hospitalized, even though there was a justification to do so. Not all clients are fully cooperative. I mean, one of my very first clients I ever had was extremely non-cooperative with me. And do I tell this story? I feel like I might have told it before, but in brief, I was in my first quarter of internship, and I was tasked with an assignment to videotape one of my clients so that my supervisors and my professors and my classmates would be able to watch me do therapy and tell me what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong. And I had this client that I was getting along with really well, and so I chose him. And I had to rent or check out the video camera from the university, this big thing, with a VHS tape in it and a giant tripod and everything. And I somehow managed to set it up in this tiny little therapy office. It was very imposing. And I had permission from this guy in a previous session. I was like, "Is it okay if I film our next session?" And it was mainly filming me, if memory is accurate. And so I sit down with him, and I'm nervous because the camera's on, and he proceeds to not say anything, like not just quiet, but literally nothing. He just sits there and stares at me. I think maybe at the very beginning he's just like, "I don't know, you tell me," or something like this, really combative. And I'm like, fuck, what? Now looking back, I wish I would have just packed up the camera and said, "Oh, well, I don't know what's happening, but let me turn off the camera and pack it up and then let's try this again." But I'm literally in week 3 of being a therapist. I don't know what I'm doing, and I have this assignment, and I only have so many clients, and so I don't know what to do. Anyway, it was a very painful 50 minutes of session. And then at the last minute, I'm like, okay, well, that's the end of the session. And I'm thinking, what in the world is my supervisor and my professors going to tell me about the session? I mean, what are they going to tell me I shouldn't be a therapist? Which actually did happen with my supervisor, which I write about in my supervision book. But anyway, I said that to my client. I'm like, well, that's the end. And in a large degree, I was really relieved that the session was over because it was so painful. I mean, at the very least, it's just boring, right? To just stare at someone that's not wanting to talk to you and you can't do anything, right? I mean, I could have, but anyway. So I say the session's over, and then he stands up and he says, "I'm going to kill myself." In the last 5 seconds. And so I'm like, and I knew enough to know I didn't know what to do. And I said, "Can you just wait here for a second?" I left the room, and I got my supervisor. And if you're aware of this whole story, because I was fired from my first internship, like in the first 8 weeks or something. And I had my very first supervisor, who was a good supervisor, but my second and then that supervisor, the good supervisor was the guy who hired me, the one that I wanted to work with. But then quit or he offloaded me onto someone, and and he did it pretty quickly, because I was only at this internship for about 8 weeks, and he transferred me to this other supervisor like after week 3 or 4 or something. And that second supervisor, was the one that I think targeted me for bigoted reasons or something, and fired me. And I wrote about this in the whole. In the book, I might have referred to that second supervisor as my first supervisor, but he wasn't really technically my first. Anyway, but the guy that I went to in this scenario was my very, very first supervisor that I liked, and he came into the therapy office and actually addressed the situation. Anyway, so can you have that client? And we didn't do an involuntary hold with him, because my supervisor did an assessment and found that he wasn't imminently at risk, and so that was that. The session ended. But could he have that client, let's say, have been combative further with me or my supervisor and said, I'm not going to answer any more of your fucking questions? Well, if you don't have any reassurance that the client isn't imminently at risk and they have said that they're going to kill themselves, then you have no choice than to call the authorities. And if the authorities interact with him, the MHPs, and he's also combative, then under a lot of circumstances, they also have no choice but to hospitalize. It's not, they're not confident or comfortable hospitalizing someone without any kind of, any kind of overt communication about risk. But if someone says they're going to kill themselves and they don't say anything to refute that they aren't imminent because they're not saying anything, then you're kind of forced to involuntarily hospitalize them. Can you have someone like that leaves, that says at that point, like the MHPs are like, okay, well, we're going to hospitalize you, and he's just like, fuck you, I'm not going to go. And they're like, well, then we have to call the police, and they're going to have to handcuff you and bring you in, and say that happens. And then at that point, as the police are coming, he says, oh, I was lying. I wasn't actually suicidal. I was just doing it to be a dick. Well, at a certain point, once you cross that threshold, you can't trust that the client is telling the truth at that point, right? So you might have to move forward with the hospitalization. Can you have someone like that who goes online and says that my therapist, all I said was, I didn't even, that I thought about suicide, and I didn't even say I had a plan, and then they hospitalized me, and what kind of bullshit is that? That's why no one should ever tell their therapist. Could something like that happen? Yes, it could. So when you are online and you see people saying shit like emergency health services, like a psychiatric hold is more damaging than it's good, then I don't know who you're talking to. Now, again, can psychiatric holds be harmful? Does that happen? Yeah, absolutely happens. It happens enough of the time. I've never seen it happen personally, but because there's a lot of checks and balances in the way, but like one example is you have parents who convince the MHPs that their teenage kid, although is not imminently at risk, is imminently at risk, and the kid is almost being punished by the parents, for not being compliant with rules or something, and manages to manipulate the system to hospitalize the kid. Does that happen? Yeah, that can happen. But in general, that is not the case. In my experience, I guess I'd have to look at the research to know the incidence of it. Let's take a break. All right, lightning round. Patron Megan says, personality disorder diagnoses will become obsolete, and we will look back on them like we look at hysteria, imbalanced humors, and the label mental retardation. In particular, borderline, histrionic, and perhaps narcissistic will be seen as offensive language, and arguably rightfully so. End of hot take. Yeah, this is the sort of hot take that I was looking for when I asked people to submit theirs. So I agree with the foundation of these notions that the labels such as hysteria or borderline are not, when we look at them through, like for myself, when I learned about these disorders and the constructs like histrionic or or borderline or whatever, or even like avoidant personality disorder. I mean, that word doesn't really describe. It should be called like social anxiety personality disorder or shyness personality disorder or something. Or the word codependent. It actually really is confusing to people because they think it means two people who are overly dependent on each other, but it actually is referring to the co-pilot in a dependency to of a substance. Like, it should be like co-addict is a better term. Anyway, there are all sorts of words that are from 100+ years ago that aren't very helpful. Even the word countertransference has a lot of different meanings to it. But if you just look at the term, it's just counter to transference. But of course, we understand that the way we use it today, you can have countertransferential feelings and reactions that have nothing to do with transference from the client. So we've been talking about this for decades. There was a pretty big movement over the last 30 years to change the DSM. DSM-5 I assumed was going to move forward with this proposed different way of talking about personality disorders. Like they're all on kind of these spectra, and the system was fine, but I don't know if it would have helped or not. It could have just confused people further. The thing is personality disorders are confusing, and we live in a sexist, ableist society, and so our professions, our disciplines like psychology are going to reflect that. And do these terms like hysteria or histrionic have problematic histories? Yeah. Do they have problematic current situations? Yeah. But attacking the terms, I don't think is the answer. I think the answer, if we want to change the term, that's fine. Like, and I've talked about this, like with histrionic. I think a better, because the word hysteria, it's like you have to understand like the evolution of that term over the last literally 4,000 years. I mean, the word hyster comes from. Anyway, I talk about this in my deep dive, but the way it evolved in the 20th century was from, well, I don't want to get into this. Anyway, point is that I'd be all over just changing the term to attention deficit personality disorder with histrionic, or with borderline with abandonment sensitivity personality disorder. You know what I mean? And it would probably help people to have it named that, but the stigma around these constructs wouldn't necessarily change. So we would still have to work on that. The other thing is that labels like mental retardation, I'm old enough to have actually been around when mental retardation was the preferred term, not for bad reasons, but for good reasons. It just meant that people learned slower than others. That's all it was referring to. But with people using retardation or retard as an insult, it has a whole other meaning to younger people, and that's why it's offensive. The term is not offensive. The way it was used was offensive, but the term is not offensive. You understand? So, like I grew up at a time when referring to people of color was actually offensive, and then that was anyway. You get the point. But let's read this. Personality disorder diagnoses will become obsolete, and we will look back like hysteria, blah blah blah. Borderline, histrionic, perhaps narcissistic, and being offensive. Like we already consider them offensive because they are used offensively. But any expert, whether it's developmentally disabled versus retardation, or hysteria versus attention-seeking personality disorder or something, every expert, which is really all that matters, understands that there's stigma and that there's nothing offensive or harmful about these terms. That's kind of my take, is that when I say borderline, and when I think borderline or when I write it in my notes or something, I don't have any of the stigma that society does, or even in my field. I only have what it means, which is that the person has schemas related to attachment and betrayal, or abandonment and betrayal, and they have, in all likelihood, a lot of symptoms from there. That's all. It's not offensive. Why would that be offensive? It's only offensive because people bastardize a term or use or weaponize it or misunderstand it or something. But yeah, it's a good hot take, Patron Megan. Gemma, she says, being strong, quote unquote, being strong, is described as such a positive thing. But I said that funny. Being strong is described as such a positive thing. But it's just another way of saying hide your feelings. Agreed, Gemma. Absolutely agreed. Neen, she says, I think self-diagnosis is good. Actually, I think I might have read this one on the hot take episode with Isaiah. Yeah, I think I did. So we'll skip that one. Patron and YouTube member Chris, she says, most people are taking illegal drugs to manage their mental health needs. So of the people who are taking illegal drugs, they're doing so to manage their mental health needs. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think most experts, it depends on what we mean by managing one's mental health needs. But yeah, it's well understood that trauma, learned helplessness, depression, low self-esteem, just general emotional distress or oppression from the outside world, or the stress of poverty, whether it's just the practical stress of paying your bills or the self-esteem stress of poverty. It's well understood that those are factors, if not the main factors, when it comes to differentiating between people that will dabble in a substance versus those who develop a big problem with it. Patron Lou, she says, good mental health begins and ends with self-compassion. Good mental health begins and ends with self-compassion. Yeah, I agree. Patron Piggy, he says, mental health is fundamentally incomplete with modernity. Incompatible, sorry. That's my dyslexia kicking in. Mental health is fundamentally incompatible with modernity. You can condition and medicate the caveman brain as much as you want, but there will always be serious dysfunction outside the primitive communal life that we evolved for. End of hot take. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it depends what we mean by that. But yeah, I did an episode with that guy who wrote Sex at Dawn, and he also wrote the other book that I interviewed him about a while back. What was it, Christopher or something? Anyway, and his whole book, I think it's called like Civilized to Death or something. And I had, prior to interviewing him, had a basic understanding of this way of looking at our current situation as a society and as humans. But after talking with him, it really solidified it, that we tend to think about progress as a society by looking at technological advances, and we don't look at the big picture or about individual markers of what is good in life, like happiness or lowering indicators of mental health problems. Like as an example, we will, especially, in a capitalistic society, but also like a tech-oriented society that one could argue we are a part of, that we will say as a society that, oh, look, we have self-driving cars now, or we have AI, or we have, even you could say, oh, we have like renewable energy sources. And we're progressing, once we didn't have airplanes, but then we did. And then we were like on the moon, and look at us as a human race. We are progressing and we're solving the world problems. We're like curing diseases and all this stuff. And all that's true. But if you actually look at human happiness, compatibility with one's needs, a lot of indicators seem to be indicating that at the very least, we're not progressing. We might even be making things worse. People are more lonely. They're more isolated. They're more angry. They're more upset. They're, more likely to engage in habitual vices that are just trying to get them through the day. They're working a lot more. They're spending a lot more, and yet everyone feels like they're that, they don't have enough time or they don't have enough things or whatever, And so we just continue to walk down the road towards more horribleness and oblivion without ever stopping to think, wait, what is it that we want and need actually? Social media being an example of that, right? That it's like, oh my God, we can now do all these things, and how great is that? And then we look at all the horribleness involved in it. Anyway, Anonymous from Switzerland, she says, too much self-focus reflection is not helpful. Not all needs to be analyzed and categorized. Also, not everyone is safe all the time, and we cannot expect that. Safe in quotes. All right, so Anonymous in Switzerland. Too much self-focus and reflection is not helpful. Yeah, I think there were a number of hot takes along these lines. I'd be curious as to what people mean exactly by this. But yeah, can you have an individual who spends too much time on self-reflection and not enough time actually getting their needs met or dealing with their responsibilities of the day? Sure. But it's not typical, right? And then see, not all needs need to be analyzed and categorized. Yeah, and I don't know anyone who does feel the need to analyze and categorize all their needs. I think this is a statement from someone who is in an echo chamber that, or has experiences that, I don't know, it's easy for me to accuse from afar, but where they just, for whatever reason, don't like to do a lot of self-reflection themselves, or they find that self-reflection around them, maybe their spouse or something, somehow aggravates them, gets in their way, or prevents them from being happy or something. And I think there was some other people that were saying things along these lines, which, I do agree with, that a lot of research, and we've known this in psychology for a long time, not only within the realm of positive psychology, but also humanistic psychology and other kinds of areas, that there is a mode in which some people can get into, and maybe even people in therapy and into psychology, that in order to be happy, we have to look inward. We have to uncover, we have to turn over every rock, and we have to look at those things and fix those things and address those things, and only then can we be happy, or through that process we can be happy. Whereas we absolutely know that for a lot of people, if they can just not focus on themselves, then they generally are happier and healthier. It depends, right? It's case by case. Obviously, avoidance of your issues is not usually going to be good, but it is something to think about with some people in some situations, that if they were to, for example, volunteer at a shelter or something, or they were to foster kids or foster animals and take care of them, or be more involved in the community, or if they're grandparent, if they themselves are grandparents, if they spend more time with their grandkids, reading to them, or hanging out, doing things that the grandkids want to do, giving to them, right? Or becoming a soccer coach or something, and or being a therapist for that matter. And through that, even though you haven't, through that process, looked at yourself or cured anything about yourself or learned anything about yourself, people can feel better, can feel more fulfilled, and whatever sort of problem that was going on, whether, maybe even trauma, that through that process, it has less sting to it. Now, it's complicated, though, because you have plenty of people that will deny and avoid those things for, understandable reasons. And so they're resisting self-reflection along those lines. Plus, you have a lot of people who have stigma around people who, I'll never forget, I had a friend, when I first decided to become a therapist, I was becoming I'm 24, and all of my friends and family did not know that I wanted to be a therapist, because I didn't know I wanted to be a therapist. And so it was quite a left turn for everyone in my circle. And I was suddenly becoming a nerd for all things psychology. I just wanted to absorb and talk about it a lot, which, is understandable, but I'm sure I was annoying at times. And there was one of my friends that apparently I had been annoying because there was this book that I was assigned in class, and it had this like worksheet that was like asking questions about yourself, and it wasn't super self-disclosing. It was probably like, when you think about joy, like what does that feel like to you? Or so I don't know. It was probably pretty easy to answer. And I'm reading this thing, and I'm kind of doing it in my head, and then I was hanging out with a friend casually, and I turned to him, and I was like, oh, like there's this really interesting set of questions, like what do you think about this question? What would you say to this? And he got angry at me. And he just turned to me and was like, not everything has to be looked at all the time, that kind of thing. And I was just like, what the fuck? And because I hadn't been bothering him. It was like I'm still friends with him. I have analyzed him. I've known him for a long time. I think I know where this comes from, and it's not anything good. And so I think you have people out there that are just they just have a policy that, because of their issues growing up and the models that they have absorbed, that it's a threat, and they don't want to talk about it, and they're annoyed by people talking about it. And so they start to fall into either this way of thinking or an echo chamber that is just like everyone's navel gazing and or, like an anti-psychiatry stance like Scientology or Tom Cruise, this kind of thing. And so, there's obviously a lot that we could talk about, some of which I'm on board with, some of which I'm very much not. But then this last statement is also another kind of conservative, problematic point of view. Not everyone is quote unquote safe all the time, and we can't expect that. So, you'll hear people talking about safe spaces, and you'll hear people pushing back on that. We could talk about that for a long time, but I think we know what Anonymous from Switzerland is getting at. But anyway, YouTube member Leslie, she says, quote unquote, I have anxiety is sometimes an excuse for cowardice, not facing life challenges or trying to rise to the occasion. Okay. Although, but YouTube member Leslie is saying sometimes. So I have anxiety is sometimes an excuse for cowardice. Yeah, I'm not a fan of the word cowardice because that implies, usually when we're saying cowardice or someone is a coward, that, well, I don't know. It depends on what Leslie means by coward. But, could some people be using that as an excuse, whether they have anxiety or not, to avoid things that they don't need necessarily to avoid? Yeah, that happens all the time. All right. Patron Sarah B., she says, I think I agree, but avoidance can be an important part. I think I agree, but avoidance can be an important part of healing. Avoidance can be an important part of healing. Yes, I am in intensive 3 times per week psychotherapy plus couples therapy and psychiatry check-ins. Sometimes I need a break from confronting my demons to refuel and come back for more. End of hot take. Yeah, absolutely. One way of framing that is that it's avoidance. Another is that you need a breather or you're going too fast, and you're saying you're in an intensive 3 times per week therapy plus couple therapy plus psychiatry check-ins. And sometimes it's too much and you want to take a break. And so I'm guessing that you, Patron Sarah B., will tell people around you, or maybe even your clinicians, that you would like to slow down or you would like to take a break, or maybe even in session, you're just like, can we just talk about the weather? Because this is, and your clinicians maybe say this, or maybe you just inherently believe this, that you're avoiding things. And yeah, it is funny because it kind of relates to the previous 2 hot takes from the other side of things, right? That, you're just making excuses because you're too weak or something, and that's silly. I relate this to grief. In my grief book, one of the major points is the only model of stages, so to speak, of grief that actually pans out when you look at humans has to do with this dual process of grieving at times and then rebuilding at times. And the rebuilding can be often seen as avoidance, but it's not avoidance. It's a natural process. Anyway, let's read one more. Patron Mesa from Finland, she says, "You don't need a new life direction or diagnosis. You need movement, healthier food, sleep, and airplane mode." End of hot take. You don't need a new life direction or diagnosis. You need movement, meaning exercise, healthier food, sleep, and airplane mode. Yeah, I mean, it's framed in a hot take way, but is that true for some people? I'm sure. Yeah. It's interesting. All these are kind of in a similar category, are they not? All right. Well, let's adjourn there. Tune in next time when I continue going over these hot takes. I've only gotten a bit through it, so next time, truly, I'm going to do speed round. And take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.